and by other commentators.
Sorry, Rory, that's my fault.
Not at all. And by other commentators, I mean, such as Paul Bew, for example, or people in the Centre for Policy Studies, that in some way the protocol breaches the consent aspect of the Good Friday Agreement. And this line was repeated recently at the publication of the Internal Market Bill. This is obviously, I mean, not correct as far as the letter of the agreement goes. And the protocol itself is very clear that the principle of consent, which it refers to, is the principle of consent regarding the constitutional status of Northern Ireland as set out in the Good Friday Agreement, which clearly cannot be affected by the protocol and its operation. At the same time, however, when you get into the somewhat vaguer area of the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement or its implications, there is at least an arguable case, in my opinion, that the imposition of controls and checks between Northern Ireland and Great Britain is, to some extent, out of line with the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, and also to the point that it was agreed, if you like, without the agreement of the elected representatives of Northern Ireland, and in particular of unionism. Of course, precisely the same can be said, and I think with greater force, about other potential consequences of Brexit, and of course Brexit itself. Brexit itself was a breach of the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, and the imposition of checks and controls between North and South would also be, to some extent, a breach of the Good Friday Agreement. So the problem always was that there would have to be, despite the hope back in 2017 that there would be alternative arrangements other than the backstop, the reality was there was always going to have to be a choice of some kind, as you all know very well. Philip Hammond, I remember saying early to Simon Coveney, there's a circle here to be squared, and I don't think it can be squared. It has to be said, I think, that the Irish government was much quicker, much more energetic, and much more consistent in advancing its interpretation of the aspects of the Good Friday Agreement which mattered most in the negotiations. And our position, I think it's fair to say, was accepted largely without interrogation, either by the EU partners and institutions, or indeed until it was too late by the British government, too late from its point of view. When Theresa May talked about no British Prime Minister being able to agree to the arrangements proposed by the Commission in February 2018, she was essentially fighting against something to which she had broadly agreed previously. So the Irish government, say, was quicker and more, but at the same time, it was quicker and more energetic, as I said. Though in 2 footnotes, I will note that early on, in the first 6 months of the after Brexit, the Irish government was quite open to finding technical solutions to the problem of the border, but the Commission was particularly firm and, one might say, unprepared to offer flexibility in terms of the application of rules and standards. And secondly, when there was a serious risk of a no-deal Brexit, we were moving to a position where we would have accepted limited checks and controls away from the border if that had been the price of maintaining single market access. This is a complex equation, and just worth remembering. Second political point, the role of the Northern Ireland Executive in implementing the protocol. Now, clearly, the commitments are an obligation are on the British government. Much of the implementation of the protocol is for the British government, but it's important to remember that the Department of Agriculture in Northern Ireland will play an important role in administering the necessary checks and controls, which are, as we know, particularly significant in the agriculture sector. My understanding is in the Joint Committee, there has been a decent engagement, and in and around the work of the Joint Committee, there's decent engagement in civil servants in the Department of Agriculture and their opposite numbers in Brussels and London. But of course, the Minister for Agriculture, Edwin Poots, has, to the best of my knowledge, refused to engage in discussion on the role of his department in the implementation of the agreement. This may or may not matter. And it's very unfortunate, of course, that the British government threw the question of the compatibility of the protocol with the agreement back into the mix at the time of the Internal Market Bill, precisely a few days after Arlene Foster had signalled a move to a more pragmatic position. Third point I wanted to make regards the whole question of the future democratic consent in Northern Ireland to the arrangements in Articles 5 to 10 of the protocol. These are set out in Article 11. They're very well described by David Finnemore in an early paper from January this year. Just to recall that there has to be a vote by the 1st of January 2025, 4 years after the end of the transition.
Rory, you're breaking up, I'm afraid. Rory, I think we're going to cancel you for the moment and come back to your third and fourth points when you get a chance to rejoin us. But in the interest of time, I think I'll move straight to Federico, if I may. Federico, would you like to come in?
Yes, sure. Thanks. Thanks, Chris. Let me thank also Stephen. I'm delighted for the invitation you extended to me to be here and to share the stage with several colleagues and friends. Let me also share the screen with you as I've prepared a couple of PowerPoints. So you should all see them now. There you go. Okay, so what I would like to do in my 5 minutes is really to offer a quick legal perspective on the Northern Ireland Protocol and the UK Internal Market Bill, which I regard as being essentially the biggest obstacle towards, on the one hand, a faithful execution of the protocol, and on the other hand, a fruitful relation between the EU and the UK moving into the new year. So I'd like to take a legal perspective of that. Now, before starting, let me say I want to apologize. I'm the only panelist who hasn't shared notes before or a webinar today, but as Chris indeed said, I have been editing a book that came out at the end of October entitled The Withdrawal Agreement, which is the second volume in the Law and Politics of Brexit series I run at Oxford University Press. And I'd just like to emphasize we have a preface by Michel Barnier in the volume. So I would recommend this as something to be looked on by the audience. Now, moving on to the structure of my presentation, I'll basically focus on 3 points. First, I want to zoom in on the contested provision of the Internal Market Bill and explain a little bit what they do. Secondly, I want to outline the conflicts or violation that the Internal Market Bill makes of the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland attached to the withdrawal agreement. And then finally, I will say something about the legal consequences and possible judicial remedies to deal with this situation. I shall say those are remarks I've been building over time, and some of the colleagues here might have heard about them before. Now, to get started, all of you will be familiar with this, but the Internal Market Bill tabled in the British Parliament in September includes in Part 5 a series of provisions, sections 40 to 45, which are prima facie in contrast with the provision of the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland in the withdrawal agreement. And specifically, section 45, the so-called notwithstanding clause, explicitly says that the prior provisions will have effect, notwithstanding any relevant domestic law with which they might be incompatible, including the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, you know the House of Lords has voted overwhelmingly to remove those clauses from the Internal Market Bill, but the UK government hasn't yet accepted to do so. So what we're facing here is really a clear conflict of law. Now, what type of conflict of law is it? Of course, it's first and foremost, or first to begin with, a conflict at the level of international law. As you know, one of the basic principles of international law is the principle of pacta sunt servanda. This is enshrined in Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties that states that every treaty in force is binding upon the parties and must be performed in good faith. Nevertheless, what I want to very much emphasize is that the violation of the Northern Ireland, of the Internal Market Bill, is not just a violation of international law. And the reason is that the negotiators of the withdrawal agreement were very much aware of the risk that could derive by the UK dualist position towards international law. And therefore, what they did was to entrench into the withdrawal agreement a specific clause, Article 4 of the withdrawal agreement, which states that the WA shall produce in respect of and in the United Kingdom the same legal effects as those which they produce within the European Union. And now, this basically means the withdrawal agreement, including the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, has direct effect and enjoys the principle of supremacy as any other EU law for the member state. Britain has actually executed this clause because Section 5 of the EU Withdrawal Agreement Act 2020 has amended the EU Withdrawal Act 2018, adding a new Section 7A, the purpose of which is to give direct effect and supremacy to the withdrawal agreement within the UK legal system. Now, if this is correct, that has consequences, I think, in terms of the remedies which are available. Of course, you have interstate remedy that operate at the level of international law, if you will, and these turn around the role of the European Court of Justice. I don't want to enter into the details here of these provisions. We can come back in the Q&A session, but essentially the ECJ maintains supervisory and enforcement powers during the transition period, and in any case, it will have jurisdiction with regard to the relevant provision of the Northern Ireland Protocol, even after the transition period, which is why the Commission has now started infringement proceedings against the UK because of the internal market bill. Nevertheless, since the withdrawal agreement enjoys a special status within the British legal system, I think there is possibly an avenue for action for domestic judicial review within the UK system. Now, admittedly, this is untested territory, and Section 38 of the EU Withdrawal Agreement Act 2020 has reaffirmed the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, but at the same time, you're all very much aware that UK Supreme Court, at least in the two Miller judgments, has not shied away from ensuring respect for the rule of law. So that certainly provides potentially an interesting point, because to conclude once again, I think the implementation of the protocol really goes hand in hand with the development of future EU-UK relations. So understanding those issues and the legal prospect ahead is extremely important, and I can only reassure you that the Brexit Institute will, of course, continue to work on this issue. So I would hope we can continue engagement on those points as well. And I'll stop here.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Which leads us very neatly, I think, to Dagmar Sheik.
Yes, and Dagmar Sheik also, first of all, thanks for the invitation. And also apologies that I couldn't follow two of the seminars because I was moving and hugging around. I also would like to share a screen. I hope this works. I think I'm allowed to. And here we go. Can everybody see those slides now?
Yeah, it's fine, Dagmar.
Very good. And I'll try to do. So I have loads of slides, but I know that for everything and you know everything. So what I'm going to argue in a nutshell is that there's a integration through rights, which is a unique achievement of the EU, only partially is provided as a continuous element through the withdrawal agreement. It's not a contradiction to what Federico said, but a different proposal. And so I think if we want to continue integration through rights on the island of Ireland, then it's a future relationship which needs to do the heavy lifting, and the protocol can only in a very limited capacity contribute to that. So this argument, of course, starts from the idea that the Belfast Good Friday 1998 agreement, I stick to Good Friday agreement in my talk, was not only, while it only partially mentions European Union law as a basis, is actually based on the idea that both Ireland and the UK are members of the EU. So, for example, the Good Friday Agreement creates a hybridity of Northern Ireland because it belongs to the UK for the time being, and that can be changed. And also citizens of Northern Ireland, the people of Northern Ireland have the right to align themselves with the UK, with Irish or both citizenships. Also, and also even more importantly, in the part of socio-economic improvement of Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement demands from the UK to improve the socio-economic condition in Northern Ireland. And because geography has its force, that can only be achieved to a certain extent through an all-island economy. And in both these aspects, the agreement depends on EU membership. For border regions, the EU opens shifting allegiances as an option, as a legal guarantee. And for socio-economic improvement, the EU opens a rights framework which allows economic actors to develop truly transnational economies without giving up their state allegiance in the time they prefer. Now, the Northern Ireland Protocol, as you all know, has developed over time, but I don't think it can replicate this. It started out as a common regulatory area between Northern Ireland and the EU, to which the UK then was aligned under May, and it now has come down to a chaos thing. If we only look at the internal market part, which Rory also mentioned, we have moved from a common customs territory to a common customs territory of GB and NI, which also means NI is subject to the EU Customs Code. We have state aid rules applying in relation to transnational transactions of goods between Northern Ireland and the EU. We don't have any level playing field provision between NI and the rest of the EU. And the enforcement of it is a problem. So do we have any continuation of the basis, which I think is a basis for the functioning of the Good Friday Agreement in practice, not its legal functioning? Well, if you look at free movement of goods, as I mentioned in some chat function, the October 2018 version of the Northern Ireland Protocol made a full reference to Article 34, 36 TFEU. That has vanished. We now have a very partial application of those articles to Northern Ireland. There are no rights guarantees in relation to free movement of persons and to citizenship rights. There are provisions on that, I'll come to that. And when it comes to free movement of services and free movement of capitals, there are no guarantees in the protocol. And here's another slide on people movement of human rights, which I think you've covered in a very intensive seminar I've heard, so I can just flip over this in the name of the 5 minutes. However, I would say the enforcement of those people movement rights is not entrusted to any EU institutions. And although the general provision, which Federica has mentioned correctly, of Article 4 of the Withdrawal Agreement also encompasses the protocol, I say the lack of the enforcement means that they do not have the same effects as European Union law. And that touching very nicely on Federica's presentation, it all comes down to enforcement. And I've split up this slide into 2 slides because I think it's barely visible. So you did say, and that's correct, that the withdrawal agreement obliges the United Kingdom to ensure that the rights guaranteed in the withdrawal agreement and its protocols have the same effect as if they were EU law. However, I submit that the devil is in the detail, and this detail is how it's going to be enforced. And if you look at the main part of the withdrawal agreement, it's the UK has to legislate to ensure the effects equivalent to the EU law. And whether that happens isn't supervised by the established system of EU CFU, the Court of Justice of the European Union jurisdiction, but rather through an international law type enforcement. Joint committee resolves disputes, then we have arbitration, and during the arbitration panels we can have references. The only exception here are the rights of citizens who have already moved and worked across borders, idiots like myself. They are protected should they stay in the UK very closely to EU law. And when it comes to the protocol, then we have specific enforcement provisions. Article 14, for example, says that the special committee supervising the protocol adheres to human rights and equality provision in relation to Article 2 of the protocol. And Article 12 says for the relations of Northern Ireland to the EU, relation to customs legislation, regulation, authorization for goods. The EU authorities remain competent and the CJEU has jurisdiction. So here we have got a stronger enforcement rule. But as we learned, I think in the second seminar, there is a limit to how far free movement of goods is guaranteed. And as I said, all the other rights are not guaranteed in the protocol. So I'm saying, where can we address those limits? Can we actually address those limits through changing the protocol, or is it the future relationship? Now, while I think that the protocol has a bit few risks, I would go into the protocol first. Everybody knows Article 11 by now, because it is the last of the seminar series. And it does say that, first of all, areas highlighted in the Good Friday Agreement, and they include service-related fields, should be kept under review. The Joint Committee, on proposal of the specific special committee for the Protocol Island, Northern Ireland, should make recommendations to change the protocol. And that offers the opportunity to expand the protocol to include other economic freedoms and include even more specific, more effective citizenship rights than it does presently. And while it is unlikely to happen during the negotiation of the future relationship, that negotiation phase is over. So can we get a change of the protocol? The little problem there is, would this violate Article 50 TEU? And even when the revised protocol came in force, of course, at Twitterati, but also debates, for example, at the German Bundestag, were fast to suggest that the revised protocol is a permanent solution within the withdrawal agreement, which contradicts Article 50, and thus implicitly member states' competence to co-ratify trade agreements going beyond mere trade. There are different views of that. German authors specifically state the protocol violates Article 50 and creates also indefensible advantages for Northern Ireland, which, although I'm now in Cork, I don't tend to see. Whereas UK authors rather stress, well, where's the guarantee that the unfettered access to the EU market, UK market, without looking into Article 50? I think that Article 13.8 of the protocol ensures that it isn't a permanent solution and just avoids a breach of Article 50. However, if the protocol would be used to create the permanent guarantee of rights enforcement which one needs to be able to implement the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, then perhaps there would be a violation. So that's why I think that the future relationship, which I have characterized here, which I have illustrated here with this slide, is the main issue where we need to adapt to proper free movement of services, proper free movement of capital, and proper free movement of persons on the island of Ireland. And can that be agreed? Can that be achieved? I think I don't need to talk that very much about this slide because these are things which are known by now. So I think it's possible if there is a neighborhood agreement, also called association agreement, which can afford market access in selected areas. And so if we get an association agreement or a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the UK, there could be either a section on Northern Ireland or there could be a general solution which allows this. Such an agreement is now required from the EU by the neighborhood clause. The question here, do those agreements have direct effects? That's, of course, a traditional issue of European Union law. There are some rulings of the Court of Justice of the European Union in relation to environmental international agreements, which empower NGOs and citizens vis-à-vis the member states to enforce those international agreements. As regards free movement of persons, there's a long-standing case law on the effects, direct effects of the decision 180 of the Association Council on the EU-Turkey relationship, which recognizes direct effects. And there are a few rulings which even hint on horizontal relationships. And as regards the Euro agreements with former socialist states of the early 1990s, effects of the equal treatment provisions vis-à-vis states have also been recognized. And I've given you a source here really old, where you can look that up. Now, in none of these, there's much case law on the horizontal relationship, but depending on the content of the association agreement, direct effect would be a possibility, although it may not be feasible politically. So I end up with my question: can the Northern Ireland Protocol do the heavy lifting, which is still required to ensure that the underlying conditions for the Good Friday Agreement to work and practice can be recreated after the UK left the EU? I'm saying, well, it could be used. Article 11 of the protocol could be used. It would be a risky strategy, and that's why it would be better to use the future relationship. However, whether the future relationship is going to be agreed, I hope Tony will tell us, but we don't know. And I end with this. Now I need to stop sharing. Here we go. Manage that, and I'm back to the full meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dagmar. And the mention of the various committee system brings us, again, very neatly to Katie.
Thank you very much, Chris. And hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be on this particular panel in this series of seminars. So Rory mentioned the issue of consent. And a point that I would like to make, again, as a non-lawyer, as a political sociologist, is the point about the legitimacy of the protocol. And I would argue, of course, you'd not be surprised to hear me say this, that the consent vote is no substitute for legitimacy, and that there are decision-making bodies overseeing the protocol that have really great importance for the future of Northern Ireland and the operation of the protocol, and therefore its legitimacy. So I'm just going to focus my brief remarks on those. To outline them very briefly, and you're familiar with all of these, we have the Joint Committee, co-chaired by Michael Gove and Mara Sefcovic, which is tasked with overseeing the implementation of the protocol. We have the Specialised Committee on the protocol, which is co-chaired by officials on the UK-EU side, and this is to facilitate and administer the implementation of the protocol. We have the Joint Consultative Working Group, the JCWG, it just rolls off the tongue, which is there as a forum, in theory, to exchange information and enable mutual consultation. We've only got the rules of procedure for those at the moment. For that, at the moment, it's not yet been established. And then, of course, we also have the North-South implementation bodies, the NSMC, North-South Ministerial Council, and then the human rights bodies that are to directly feed into the Specialised Committee. So far in this year, we've had 4 meetings, plus an extraordinary meeting of the Joint Committee. The last meeting of the Joint Committee was on the 19th of October. We've had 4 meetings of the Specialised Committee. The last one of those was on the 5th of November. And as I say, we've only just got the rules of procedure for the Joint Consultative Working Group still to be confirmed. So I just want to focus on lessons that we can draw from the way that those 2 bodies have operated in this transition period, bearing in mind the importance of these bodies for Northern Ireland and indeed the island of Ireland in the coming years. Perhaps I should just recognise at the start that we have had such an extraordinary year, and that obviously the operation of these bodies has been very much affected by the conditions of COVID, and this has no doubt affected communication within teams as well as between teams in these particular bodies. So I've just got 5 very brief points to make, and they'll seem a little bit superficial given the time constraints, but anyway, these are the 5 ones that I think are just worth noting at this point. The first is the lesson about the importance of having a formal hub for the UK and the EU to meet. Seems a bit of an obvious one, but actually in a funny way, perhaps the Joint Committee has offered that in unexpected ways, and just as a means of establishing some form of meeting, being able to call the Joint Committee, for example, in those extraordinary circumstances following the UK Internal Market Bill. That showed that importance of that formal hub, that formal meeting point. The fact that Barnier was present is also notable, and the fact that other member states decided to show up, again, that just shows the importance of that particular body as a formal hub. This will be important going forward as well. The second point is the vulnerability of these bodies to political machinations. Again, nothing too surprising there, but perhaps they've been more affected by these than we might have liked to have imagined, especially given that we have the withdrawal agreement and we have the protocol, because we wanted these things to be separated off from the ongoing UK-EU negotiations. And indecision at political level has affected the operation of these bodies. And we've seen this by the fact we haven't had this joint committee since the 19th of October, the fact that the meeting that we expected of the joint committee last Friday was postponed. We're hoping to have it very soon in the next few days, but who knows? And this shows that very much it's the case that the fact that these things can be flexible, that they can be movable. All this does is emphasize the dangers there and the risks in terms of the lack of transparency in the way that these bodies are operating, which brings me to my third point, the difficulty in scrutinizing what's going on in these particular bodies. And I'm not being sensationalist here. The fact that we don't have a very detailed agenda for the joint committee, the fact that whether we have an agenda at all published in advance for the specialized committee is a bit ad hoc. In some cases, we haven't had an agenda at all. And then, of course, in terms of what's released afterwards, we have separate statements from the UK and the EU after the joint committee, and then we have a very carefully worded common press statement, joint shared press statement after the specialized committee. But these are not sufficient for us to have a clear sense of the wider discussions that are going on and the importance of the decisions that are being made by the joint committee. All in all, the points 2 and points 3 combined, we see just how much uncertainty is not being addressed by the operation of these bodies at the moment. A fourth point is concern about the information that is being put into the specialized committee. And again, I'm not trying to claim anything here. I'm just saying that it's too unstructured at the moment. Again, allowing for the very unusual circumstances of this time, there is uncertainty about where the evidence is coming from that these decisions are being made, or that these recommendations are being made from the specialized committee to the joint committee. There seems an awful lot placed on the importance of individual meetings or lobbying indeed. And again, there is concern, therefore, about the quality of decisions that are being made ultimately by the joint committee, not least because individuals become too important in all of this. It shouldn't be that case. And then finally, the fifth point is about the lack of clarity about the future. So actually, we don't know how who's going to be responsible for overseeing the protocol in terms of departmental responsibilities on the EU side. Is it going to be a commissioner responsible for overseeing this? What's going to happen to the UK task force? And these decisions need to be made pretty quickly because, again, those people who are sitting on the specialized committee are going to be making extremely important decisions and recommendations, rather, vis-a-vis Northern Ireland going forward. So all these concerns point to the importance of the Joint Consultative Working Group. And I'm just going to run off just a list of points that we really need to get some decisions being made on as soon as possible regarding the way that this Joint Consultative Working Group will run, because bearing in mind all these particular concerns. So we need clear, good quality information going into the specialized committee. It needs to be up to date, and it needs to be able to cover all the various dimensions of what's happening in EU law that may have knock-on effects on the protocol, and indeed what's happening on the UK or indeed Northern Ireland side as well. We need expertise from Northern Ireland. The Business Engagement Forum is not enough. We need expertise from Northern Ireland that covers a broad range of areas covered by the protocol. We need monthly meetings that won't be moved, that won't be put off because it's politically awkward. We need to have a date for those, an agenda for those, and a clear output from them as well. We need downloading, if you like, from the Joint Consultative Working Group, as well as uploading into it, and we need to know who is uploading into this Joint Consultative Working Group. more vaguely, we need relationships to be built. We need this thing to be established soon so that levels of trust and confidence can be built. We need a monitoring of the protocol as it's this evolving body. And all of this is just the beginning, but really it's just to recognize the fact that the protocol is a dynamic arrangement that will have huge, significant and ongoing implications for the island of Ireland, for North-South and East-West. And this rather obscure and clunkily named body could actually become really vitally important when it comes to the long-term legitimacy and operation of the protocol. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Rory, you were cut off in your prime, or at least midway through your third point. Can I bring you in for your last 2 points, and then we'll turn to Tony?
Sorry about that. And I think we had been tempting fate, Chris, by discussing breakdowns in Wi-Fi just before we all came on air. As I say, my first point had been that the protection of all aspects of the Good Friday Agreement equally was never going to be possible with Brexit, and the decisions made to privilege certain elements owed a great deal to the energetic advocacy of the Irish government. Secondly, the unknown factor, which is the responsibility of a Northern Ireland Minister for Agriculture in particular in the implementation of the protocol, and particularly obviously if the nightmare scenario of a ban on Marks and Spencer pork pies and whatever comes to fruition. My third point was related to the arrangements in Article 18 about the question of future democratic consent. And as everyone knows, this was introduced as a sop to the unionists, essentially. But of course, it fell well short of achieving that end for two reasons. First of all, no question of advance consent. And secondly, the fact that, despite the rather complicated processes set out, it will be possible for that consent to be given by a simple majority. And again, I would have to say that that is perhaps a necessary, and would be regarded by us in the Irish government as necessary, but it is, again, a departure, you could say, certainly from the spirit of the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement when it comes to cross-community consent within the Assembly on important points. Just to note that currently there are 90 member MLAs, 40 Unionist, 39 Nationalist, and 11 others. Next election due to be the 5th of May 2022. So highly unlikely that there won't be a majority in favour of the continuation of the protocol. And I suppose the real question then becomes, how controversial will this question be? Now, in 4 years or so from now, we just don't know. I suppose it'll depend on the overall state of relationships within the Assembly and the Executive. It'll also depend how the protocol works, and indeed how some of the issues raised by Katie about the visibility and sort of practical functional legitimacy of the Joint Committee, etc., work. There were some who said, including Reg MP, I think, at the time of the publication of the protocol and the withdrawal agreement, that this provision simply achieves the inevitability of reinserting a toxic question into the unionist nationalist relationship at regular intervals over the period ahead, without there being any real likelihood of a decision to withhold consent. But let's see what happens. My final point then is a more positive one. Again, Dagmar referred to Article 11 on North-South cooperation, recognised in the preamble that North-South cooperation relied to a considerable extent on a common union legal and policy framework and substantial challenges created by withdrawal. And the protocol shall be implemented and applied so as to maintain, in full respect of union law, the necessary conditions for continued cooperation. And it lists 6 areas of cooperation taken from the Good Friday Agreement and another 8, and allows for other areas to be developed. My colleagues in the department worked extremely hard to identify a vast number of areas of cooperation along with their British colleagues back in 2017. So clearly, there is at least the good news is that the protocol shouldn't in itself affect the operation and indeed the development of North-South cooperation. And why is this of particular political importance at the moment? It's of particular importance at the moment because if you like, the main plank of the Taoiseach's and the government's recent Shared Island initiative is precisely the intensification and the revitalisation of North-South cooperation. That is the focus of the initiative rather than the broader, longer-term constitutional questions. Now, the effectiveness of North-South cooperation will continue to depend very largely on the level of commitment and engagement on both sides. As we know, the DUP in particular have dragged their feet on this all the way through. Will that change in the light of the Taoiseach's initiative? I don't know. But at the very least, the protocol will not interfere with that possibility. So those are my 4 points, and sorry to have disappeared. I came back halfway in through Federico, I think.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad you were able to come back in again. Tony, I'll turn to you. Your ears must have been burning, I hope, at the introduction that I gave you when you were broadcasting on RTE. I won't repeat that, but you're very welcome, and thank you for joining us, Hotfoot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris, and hello everybody. It's great to take part in this very illustrious gathering of minds on the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think just quickly, I would just run through the evolution of the Joint Committee and bring people up to date as far as I can. And, you know, I'll be building on some of the observations that Katie has made on the operation of the Joint Committee and the Specialised Committee. I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's hard at times to pause and take stock of what's happened in the past few years, because things have been so intense and have happened so quickly that you know, we forget to reflect on how quickly the protocol was revised and re-engineered last year. It happened over a 2-week period in October, and you know, the rest of the withdrawal agreement was off the shelf. It was all done, but the Northern Ireland Protocol had to be retooled, and it was no longer a backstop, but a front stop, and you had the consent mechanism. But all of the implications of what was agreed, which amounts to a de facto customs and regulatory border on the Irish Sea, all of those implications are now seemingly coming home to roost, and people are expressing amazement at what that means. And it's now moved from the abstract to people's kitchens, and you know, as Rory said, you know, pies, minced sausages, you know, day-to-day realities for people, supermarkets. But yet this was never going to be a mystery, or it shouldn't be a surprise to people. And I think so much time was wasted in the evolution of the Joint Committee and the preparedness for the protocol by the politicking in London and the denial that was there in terms of what the protocol meant, what checks and controls would be obligatory, and how these should all be prepared on time. And again, there was a clear mismatch in what the EU and Ireland saw the protocol to be for, and what the Joint Committee should do, and what the UK thought the Joint Committee should do. So on the one hand, the Commission thought that the Joint Committee was just there to implement what had already been negotiated, whereas the UK decided that it was to kind of negotiate or renegotiate parts of the protocol they didn't like, or to whittle down some of the formalities and obligations of the protocol. And that not only wasted a lot of time, but I think it created a fairly sour mood between both sides as the year dawned. And of course, because of the COVID pandemic, and then there was a reshuffle by Boris Johnson soon after January, and then all the focus shifting to the free trade agreement. It was a while before the Joint Committee could really get off the ground. And in the meantime, you had these rhetorical dismissals of what was involved by people like Boris Johnson, Dominic Raab, and other cabinet ministers. And then you had the very immediate and unexpected row about the EU presence in Belfast. And this really took the EU by surprise, because we saw with an exchange of letters between Helga Schmidt from the EU's foreign policy arm and Simon MacDonald in the Foreign Office about opening an EU office or a European Commission office in Belfast. And 1 year previously, Sir Simon McDonald seemed to be keen on the idea, but then 1 year later, it was an absolute no-no. It was rejected out of hand. And this seemed to be, to the European Commission, a breach of Article 12 of the protocol, which clearly gives EU officials the right to oversee what's happening on the ground in terms of implementing the protocol at ports or wherever. And they felt that, it was only natural that these officials should have an office to work out of. So that got things off to a bad start. And then we didn't get a clear blueprint from the British government as to how they would implement the protocol until May. So that meant that the Northern Ireland Civil Service couldn't move on the preparations, both in a policy sense or a legal sense, until they got the way paved for them by Whitehall and by the British government. So again, you had, on the one hand, a fairly unpleasant atmosphere between both sides in Brussels and London, and then you had the Northern Ireland Civil Service kind of shackled, not able to start the work of preparing for the protocol to take effect. And that in turn fed into some impatience on the European Commission side that the UK was not really serious about implementing the protocol, and there were concerns about backsliding and so on. Eventually the command paper was published in May. Then from that, we started to get more technical meetings between the European Commission and Treasury and HMRC. Things started to be moving, but again, big concerns in Brussels over infrastructure. You can't build border control posts overnight. You have to have a tender process. You have to get planning permission. And if these things are not ready by the 1st of January, then we have a problem, because any food or live animals coming into the European Union have to be processed or vetted in a designated border control post under EU law. So again, this tension flared up over whether you would have to implement the protocol to the letter, or whether you could have some derogations or flexibilities. And the UK side was always pushing towards the flexibility stroke derogation kind of force field, and the Commission was saying, well, there are flexibilities within the rules, but we can't break the rules. And somewhere in the middle, Northern Ireland businesses were there pulling their hair out, trying to figure out what was going on. This was all very difficult for everybody. I think in the summertime, again, there were some more progress in terms of technical meetings. But then in September, we had the internal market bill landed like a grenade into the middle of all this, and a lot of the trust that had been built up, or was starting to be built up, was dissipated by the internal market bill. I spoke to one senior figure in the European Commission who said, look, we've been working through all these issues in the joint committee that the internal market bill purports to address, and we've been making progress. We've been working flat out. Now it just feels like we have a gun to our heads. And again, that put things back by quite considerable distance. The EU was somewhat worried that this might be a trap laid by the UK to allow them to walk away from the negotiations. So they made a fairly quick decision to decouple the work of the Joint Committee and the internal market bill. So they followed a legal track on their response to the internal market bill. Maros Šefčovič basically gave the UK until the end of September to withdraw the clauses, and on the 1st or 2nd of October, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, announced that they were taking legal action against the UK. It was a formal letter of notice, or a letter of formal notice to the UK, saying that the internal market bill, the offending provisions there, basically broke the good faith Article 5 provision of the withdrawal agreement, and so therefore they were taking legal action. So that kind of shunted the internal market bill into a legal siding, and the Joint Committee was able to keep going. And it's hard to say whether or not the internal market bill provided some magical catalyst, but yes, there was an emergency meeting of the Joint Committee immediately after the Internal Market Bill was published, but then in a following meeting at the end of September, there seemed to be an entirely new atmosphere. Michael Gove on the UK side said that they would absolutely fulfill all the obligations of the protocol. He said that the UK would now adopt what he called an open book approach. They would be completely open as to everything they were doing. At the same time, I think tenders had been issued or contracts had been signed for physical work to start at the ports for border control posts. The EU said, okay, we don't need a physical office with a flag and a plaque outside. We can find some other way where officials can do their work. There was talk of maybe 15 vets or other inspectors, EU officials who would work alongside their Northern Ireland counterparts at the ports. So this seemed to kind of unblock some of the issues, and things started to move forward a lot more quickly. And I think overall, at that meeting on the 28th of September, there seemed a determination by both Michael Gove and Maros Šefčovič to provide a political kind of jolt to the process, to say to officials, look, these are the political solutions we want. Now you go and find the technical solutions. And so that was then delegated out to the specialized committee, and then there were teams of officials in DG Sante, DG Taxud, HMRC, all working at how they could make a technical solution fit the political imperatives. And that seems to be sort of the glide path as to the point where we're at today. I mean, certainly the UK seems to have approached this in an extremely transactional kind of a way. We want to make sure that consignments of food, mixed consignments, cabotage they call it, I think maybe there's another word. Anyway, mixed consignments of good food going to Northern Ireland supermarkets. We want to make sure that they're not completely held up by multiple customs declarations or export health certificates for any products of animal origin. You had the mythical frozen lasagna or chilled lasagna, which might cost €200 to get all the paperwork and veterinary sign off and so on. So the UK was pushing very hard on the supermarkets issue. The EU is pushing hard on the EU presence, how that's going to work. So you started to get trade-offs between one and the other, and that seems to be the way it has gone. And the way we're, just to bring things up to date today, the latest indications that I've had dating back to last Friday are that there's a choreography in place that all of these difficult, toxic Northern Ireland Protocol issues will be resolved by the middle of December. There are no major political standoffs on any big issues. And, they again, as Katie said, we've had meetings postponed. There was a meeting due last Friday. It was postponed. There's a meeting due this week. We don't know if it's going to happen or not. I think the reason for that is that there is a reach across to the free trade agreement. And if a free trade agreement is concluded, then it makes some of the issues of the joint committee and the protocol a bit easier to manage. So my guess is that they're holding fire on the critical last couple of joint committee meetings until they see what happens in the free trade agreement. And as you know, today, all that's kind of happening. Michel Barnier this morning said that the next hours will be critical. So there's talk of something perhaps happening over the next 48, 72 hours. But final word, I'm told that the outstanding difficult issues are all being magically resolved within the joint committee and the specialized committee, and that everything should be in place, even though clearly things will not be ready to go on the 1st of January. And we're probably going to see some kind of grace period for elements of the protocol, but probably not everything. Thank you.
Fascinating, as always. Thank you very much indeed. So we're 1 minute before the end of the formal procedure. What I'm going to do, if I may, subject to your the panelists' agreement, I'm going to wind up the formal proceeding because there are people I need to thank before we end and before you all leave. And then if we can go into 15 minutes or so of questions, if you're all willing to hang on for a bit. May I do that? I'll take lack of dissent as agreement. Thank you. So as I said, we've got we're just about to end. So I did want to take the opportunity of bringing the formal part of the proceedings to a close. Do stay on Zoom if you're free and can chat informally some more. But in closing, I really want to thank Stephen Britton and ICEL for cooperating so wonderfully with Queen's in hosting this series and in handling the modalities. I'm grateful, Steve. I'd also like to thank all the panelists over these 6 seminars who managed in the short time available and with the inevitable frustrations of the lack of time to bring their expertise to bear to help us to understand, if not always to navigate, the legal complexities. And finally, I want to thank all the attendees in sticking with us and for asking such stimulating questions. I suspect this isn't the last time we'll be getting together, but thank you. So as I say, we'll now turn, if I may, to some of the questions, and there's several that I think would be useful for us to turn to. Let me just mention briefly Mary Dobbs's intervention because it's an important one when she points out that the UK taxation bill that we're expecting sometime next week may introduce another series of potential violations of the protocol in a way that, if it's interpreted as a money bill, might bypass the House of Lords. And of course, the House of Lords took out the clauses in the internal market bill. So we have the potential, I think what Mary is hinting, that if the clauses are reintroduced into the internal market bill next week, when it goes back to the Commons, and we have the finance bill, the taxation bill, introducing other potential arguable violations, we are in a position that is obviously interesting politically. So if I may, I'll put the first question to all of you. If the clauses are reintroduced into the internal market bill, and if there is a potential introduction in the taxation bill of provisions, for example, determining what's at risk, can the negotiations on the future relations agreement withstand that sort of pressure? Anybody want to head off on that? Tony, can I take a sort of political take on that initially from you?
Certainly, Chris. Actually, Michel Barnier raised that this morning just when he spoke to EU ambassadors, and he said that if there were any clauses in the finance bill, or maybe taxation bill is a better way to call it, if there were any clauses in there which breached international law, then the negotiations would be in a crisis and there would be a breakdown in trust. So that was a fairly blunt take from his point of view. So, I mean, there's so much very delicate sequencing going on here. My gut feeling is that if they get an agreement over the weekend on the free trade agreement, then the UK would be just mad to bring out a finance bill with some further clauses which breach the protocol. And again, the same would apply to the internal market bill. I mean, it would just be a demonstration of such terrible faith that I just couldn't see what would be gained if they do get a free trade agreement over the line. You know, it just seems hard to see how that state of affairs could proceed. I mean, there's always been an inbuilt threat that the treaty will not be ratified if those clauses are still there, but the precise trigger is still a little bit vague. I mean, the European Parliament political groups have said that they wouldn't ratify the treaty if those clauses were still there, but they may not ratify the treaty until the 20th of December. So if the clauses are still there by then, you would have 48 hours between a deal happening and then no deal happening. So it just raises the stakes enormously if we're in that situation at the end of December.
Thanks. There's a kind of reverse question, which is one that Claire has brought up, which is if the future relations agreement negotiations collapse, if they're not concluded successfully, can the protocol withstand that shock? Rory, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, well, obviously the protocol stands under international law. I suppose the amount will also depend then, in what circumstances the free trade negotiations had broken down, whether there was a pause and an intention to resume quickly and so on. But I would have thought if there were any sustained failure to agree, that it'll be extraordinarily politically difficult to implement the protocol in full, and in particular Articles 5 to 10. I just think it would cause chaos politically within Northern Ireland, and I cannot imagine that a British government which would have taken the decision to walk away from a free trade agreement and which has already indicated its willingness to breach international law if need be, in its view, would do what was required to implement the protocol. So I mean, so despite the legal standing of the protocol, I think politics would trump that.
Daniel Halberstam, would you like to come in at this point?
Oh, sure. Thanks. Thank you very much for these really wonderful presentations. I had sort of three reactions. The first is about the good faith clause. I mean, Federico, is good to see you again, Federico. Federico put Article 26 VCLT up on the screen, and I see it coming up in the chat as well. But I think that Article 26 is a bit of a red herring, just because Article 26 is just the bare bones international law good faith compliance agreement. What we're dealing with here, though, is Article 5 of the treaty. And as Tony told us, the Commission went after the UK because of a violation of Article 5 in the UK, not because of Article 26 VCLT. And that's because 26 VCLT would not, to my mind, kick in with the mere legislative authorization for future violations. That does not necessarily trigger an international law violation. Every country is authorized to violate international law tomorrow. So an explicit authorization to do so doesn't really change very much, but it violates the much more stringent good faith agreement under a duty of good faith compliance under the EU treaties, which is reflected in Article 5 of the withdrawal agreement. The second point is Dagmar mentioned sort of as a kind of a problem that the withdrawal agreement suggests that, oh, well, we need this UK legislation to bring this in, and that was potentially a weakness. To my mind, if you look at Article 4, the mention in Article 4 that says the UK shall ensure compliance with paragraph 1 through domestic primary legislation, to my mind, that's actually sort of a strengthening of the obligation of the UK to implement this through primary legislation. That would be my emphasis in this provision, which means that the withdrawal agreement should be adopted much like the ECA of 1972 was. The ECA was primary legislation bringing EU law into UK law. And here the withdrawal agreement is sort of hinting at the same thing. It has to be primary legislation that brings the withdrawal agreement in, because otherwise you would not trigger a direct effect on primacy within the UK's legal system. And that actually echoes Article 49 of the Treaty on European Union, which also says that the ratification must take place in accordance with the constitutional requirements of the member states. That's sort of another hint that this has to be ratified at the constitutional level. So to my mind, Article 4, the reference to legislation, domestic UK legislation, is sort of elevating the treaty rather than subordinating it. And if the UK were not to follow through with primary legislation, you would have your first big deal dispute with the UK, and possibly cause for just tearing up the whole thing. The third thing, just quickly, is that I agree with Dagmar that the protocol could very well be ruled to be ultra vires Article 50. But as I suggested earlier when Thomas was here as well, I think that could be cured quite simply. So again, your point is that the Northern Ireland Protocol is potentially too stable, and therefore suggests that it's actually a long-term arrangement sort of tucked in to this withdrawal agreement. I think that could just be cured quite simply by the future relations agreement, simply by reference incorporating the Northern Ireland Protocol and all of its provisions, and just sort of essentially re-ratifying it, re-concluding it at the very end. And just I see actually Dagmar, I see Dagmar's point here in the chat about UK legislation that the EU can only raise infringement procedures directly before December 31st. There are some provisions, Articles 86 and 87, I believe, in the withdrawal agreement, where within 4 years the Commission can still go after the UK for violations committed during this transition period. So not all avenues of direct enforcement are lost after December 31st. Thanks.
I'm conscious that Tony and Dagmar are going to have to go shortly. So thank you to them, and particularly to Tony hot-footing it from RTE. Dagmar, did you want to come back on any of that?
I managed to unmute myself, yes. So the point I was making about Article 4 and of the withdrawal agreement and the UK's obligation also under the Northern Ireland Protocol to implement legislation to ensure direct effect was not that I think it's bad that the UK has to do that legislation. I do recognize that implementing through primary legislation, potentially constitutional legislation in line with the case law on the ECA, is a very strong method from internally to the UK. I was focusing on the question what the EU Commission can do, or the EU as a whole, if the UK is set to violate these agreements. And that changes so much after the 31st of December, because after violations committed after the 31st of December, this is of course the correct version. And that's the point I was making. I was making the point that the enforcement machinery of European Union law is what ensures direct effect and supremacy. And that if that ensuring of direct effect and supremacy is left to the national procedures in the UK, it is so much less secure that this will actually be affected. As to the protocol, I don't think that it does violate Article 50 presently. I think it could be made to violate Article 50 if those opportunities of Article 11 of the protocol are used too much, yeah. And so then, of course, Daniel's proposal to re-ratify it in the future relationship is a good one. However, if the whole Northern Ireland Protocol is re-ratified in the future relationship, this makes a future relationship a mixed agreement, and a mixed agreement can't be agreed in this until December, because it means all the national parliaments. So this will be a medium-term directive of changing the future relationship with such timing that in the future, after the 31st of December, the Northern Ireland Protocol can then be put on a more secure footing, especially if it's changed. Sorry for taking up too much time. I keep quiet now.
No, that's very useful. Can I just pick up that point and turn it to Katie and to Federico, particularly this question about future deals and ratification issues. So let's imagine that there is a future relations agreement. I'm sorry, Tony has just gone, but in his post this morning, he indicates his belief, at least, that any deal would face ratification by EU member states, as well as the British and European parliaments. Do you agree that that's the case? And if so, what are the implications of that? Katie, do you have your view on that?
Yes, with a somewhat heavy heart, I do agree that that's the case now, and I think that that because we really run out of time for proper process when it comes to ratifying any agreement, then there's going to be much more desire on the part of the member states to be able to scrutinize these things, and more to the point to sort of hold the UK, have a means by which they can hold the UK on a bit of a leash, for want of a better analogy. And I think, therefore, we're possibly looking at a situation where we could have like a ratification period that could be extended. Like minimal, it would be 18 months, more likely be 3 years. And this would be a point where you could have that kind of, is the UK fulfilling its obligations? This would be a live issue. And hence sort of, in effect, sort of ongoing observation of the UK, not just in relation to the, say, the provisional agreement, but also in relation to the protocol.
And Owen Fannon's raising the question not just about the potential difficulties of ratification by member state parliaments, but also of indeed the UK Parliament and the European Parliament. Federico, is it your view that ratification by each of the member states will be necessary?
Chris, I will have to leave, so I'll actually skip this question, which I think it's a bit speculative. We might know by end of the day what type of agreement is it, whether it's mixed or EU only. What I will do as a final thing, just to pick up on some other point, I think to conclude, I really want to stress, I think the faithful implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol is a precondition for a future relationship, partnership agreement between the EU and the UK. It is a matter of good faith. How could we trust Britain if of a new treaty if they haven't respected the old one? So that's quite important. And just in answering Dan point, yes, of course. I mean, Article 5 of the WA is the really important specific good faith provision, which is relevant here. I only mentioned 26 BCLT because the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said pacta sunt servanda, which is the rubric for that clause. But clearly it is Article 5, and I think what I want to say, that's really my last line. I am really convinced that the issue is becoming an issue of UK constitutional law. And I would be curious to see whether legal cases will be taken in UK courts, including in Northern Ireland, because to some extent, my legal reading of the protocol is that the protocol has now become the new British Constitution, in the same way as the European Communities Act 1972 used to be the British Constitution, as being a sort of quasi-superior law. Now, there is no written constitution in Britain, which makes things very, very flashy and very difficult to state. But clearly, by ratifying Article 4 of the withdrawal agreement, the United Kingdom has accepted the idea of direct effect and supremacy of the WA, including the protocol. So let's see what the British judges will say about that.
Well, if I can just leap in at that point. How can I put this? I think it would be useful for you to pay particularly close attention to ministerial statements on the third reading of the internal market bill in the House of Lords today on that issue. Okay.
If I may very briefly just come in on this question of ratification. Yes, I mean, I think the assumption has always been that this will be ultimately a mixed agreement and will require member state ratification. However, I mean, there are ample precedents. In the end, there has to be a proposal by the Commission for a decision to ratify. And, you know, we've seen, I think, in the recent judgment of the Singapore FTA that, you know, it's possible to proceed, and I'm not using technical terms here, it's possible to proceed more quickly on those matters within union competence, especially within exclusive competence, such as trade. So I think in a way, you know, it would be possible for the different bits of the future agreement to be differentiated from one from another, some bits applied provisionally, and maybe other pieces which would require ultimately ratification by the member states to be sort of other practices to be maintained through sort of bilateral memorandum of understanding and so on for the necessary period before full ratification.
And Rory, can I just raise a kind of linked question with you? Does that, under what circumstances would there also be an Irish referendum required?
I think it would be extremely unlikely because, there has never been a referendum. I mean, first of all, it always has to be determined, obviously, by the it always has to be determined by the government of the day as to whether it proposes a referendum, and the advice of the Attorney General weighs heavily. All I'll say is that there has never previously been a referendum on an external agreement between the Union and any other state. So I don't see how I don't see how the provisions in the Crotty case would really be implicated here. But others are more expert than me on this. But I can't see it triggering a referendum, to be honest.
Okay, perhaps on that note, we should wrap up. I know I've stretched your tolerance well beyond what was reasonable. I've noted Judge Cook's very kind comments in the chat. And unless there are other pressing issues, which of course there are, I'll wrap up and look forward, perhaps in the not too distant future, to returning to some of these questions. Perhaps if we get an agreement, or more particularly if we if we do not get an agreement in the next while. So thank you very much again, and on behalf of the participants, may I thank the panelists for today, and thank you again.
And I'm sure, Chris, on behalf of all the panelists over the 6 days, many thanks to you and to Stephen for organising and for moderating these discussions. I was able to listen into 4 of the other 5, and I must say they've been tremendous. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephen, we need to think about how best to put all of this into. I kept on promising that they were going to have access to the recordings, and some people have also been asking for access to the slides. Can you organize that, or what should I do? You're muted.
Sorry, I think as the person who set up the meeting, you'll get the Zoom link to the recordings. You can feel free to send those on to me, and I can arrange. The format we've used before is we put it onto the ICEL YouTube channel, which is a sort of private channel. We gave the attendees a link to it by email. Okay. And they can get into it, but it's not publicly available. And then that there's now I actually don't know on the technical side of that what is involved in that, but as I said before, my fiance does that kind of thing for a living, so I'm sure we'll be able to do that in the next couple of days if you send me the links.
Yeah, so what I'll do is send you the recordings by WeTransfer probably, and you can do with them what you wish. Yeah, exactly, and I'll let you know what the story is and keep you updated on progress. Thanks a million. You did the lion's share of the work on all of us, so that's great, and we reaped the benefit, so thank you so much.